particular issues. So, reasons can be complex for not receiving life. But ultimately, I believe that those reasons end up being rooted in unbelief. I think people will not enter in ultimately because of unbelief. But the grace of God is there for us to believe. I mean, it's by grace through faith that we are saved, right? And that not of ourselves. What not of ourselves? Well, some would say it's grace and some would say it's faith. I would say it's both. It's the gift of God, not of works, lest any should boast, right? It's by grace through faith that we enter in. It's God Himself who gives us the ability. And Jesus makes it clear in this passage that unless the Father draws someone, they can't believe, they can't receive. We're going to talk about that a little bit as we proceed, but reasons for not receiving, reasons for hardening hearts, reasons for unbelief are often complex, but I still believe that the reason that people don't receive and don't respond in a positive way to God's offer ultimately is because of unbelief. I want to read John 6, verse 35 through 40, which I didn't touch this morning, but I want to read that as we proceed here. John 6, 35 through 40. Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. But I said to you that you have seen me, and yet you do not believe. All that the Father gives me will come to me, and the one who comes to me I will by no means cast out. For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of Him, God the Father, who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me. This is the will of the Father who sent me, that of all He has given me, I should lose nothing, but should raise it up at the last day. And this is the will, once again, of Him who sent me, that everyone who sees the Son and believes in Him may have everlasting life, and I will raise him up at the last day. Do you realize there are 4 places in that passage in John 6 where Jesus speaks of raising up at the last day? In verses 39, 40, 44, and 54, Jesus says, I will raise the person up who believes in me at the last day. And then in verse 50, He says, whoever eats will not die. Well, will they die or won't they die? Jesus is saying they will not die eternally. Right? Jesus Himself died. He was dead for 3 days. So He's talking here about not dying eternally, never die ultimately, suffer the second death, the eternal death, that we understand to be destruction and cessation of life entirely, right? And John 6, 35 through 40 suggests on one hand that God chooses certain people for salvation, verses 37 and 39. And in verse 40 affirms that everyone who sees Jesus, the Son, and it's the will of God that all who see Jesus and believe in Him have everlasting life. Wow, powerful stuff here in His interaction with these folks, with these would-be disciples and these Pharisees. Jesus says, all who see Him and believe will have everlasting life. Certainly, millions of people have received Christ since His ascension to heaven, haven't they? Isn't that right? I mean, you're among them, aren't you? You've received Christ since He ascended to heaven. So we know that Jesus was not just referring to those who saw Him that time before His crucifixion, was He? He was talking about people seeing Him for who He is, for seeing Him and responding accordingly with believing faith. That's what He's referencing here. In this passage before us today that we read, Jesus is once again affirming the need for people to eat his flesh and drink his blood. Lord, what are you talking about? What do you mean? Boy, do you think he couldn't have just been a little nicer about it, and just say, this is what you need to do? No. He was succinctly zeroing in on what is necessary to receive eternal life. Recognizing that God has sent him to be the source of life for folks. And we're going to talk about that briefly in the brief time we have together. But to the natural mind, or naturally speaking, this is a very difficult scene, isn't it? Can you imagine what these people thought? What would you think? Unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you can have no part in me. It says here a little later in this passage that we read this morning that many said, this is a hard saying. Who can receive it? And many of his disciples turned and went away and left. Because he said, I told you, unless the Father draws you, you can't come. Wow. Many turned away. You ever had someone say in the world, they had a come to Jesus moment? You ever heard that? When the world talks about having a come to Jesus moment, what are they talking about? What they're talking about is getting real. Having reality somehow just smack dab square in the face, hit you. Isn't that what they're talking about? Having a come to Jesus moment? They don't understand really in a real sense what a real come to Jesus moment is. But they talk about being honest, just getting real, just being real, having a come to Jesus moment. Well, the kind of come to Jesus moment that Jesus wants us to have is that when you come to Jesus, you'll truly see him for who he is. You'll come to him and you'll see him for who he is, and then subsequently you'll believe in him, and subsequent to that you will receive eternal life. All who seeks the Son and believe in him will have eternal life. When you see him for who he is, when you see him as his ministry was to come and to offer himself for the sins of the world so that we might enter into relationship with God through him. That's what it means to see him and to believe he is who he says he is.